Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello. Today we're talking about the internet and what it's doing not just to our children, but pretty much everything else as well. The 22-year-old media entrepreneur, Jamal Edwards, doesn't spend much time fretting about the impact of modern technology. He's too busy living it and too taken with the opportunities it offers to anyone with the right kind of self-belief. No one, he says, cares which school you went to on YouTube. The academic Farida Viz is interested in how YouTube and the other social media are changing the meaning of news and blurring the line between that and good old-fashioned rumour. And the blogger and game designer Adrian has bigger fish to fry in his book, A History of the Future in 100 Objects. In it, he conjures a detailed and arresting vision of a late 21st century world where technology has helped us advance so far, it's hard to say what it means anymore to be human. But let's start with the here and now. InRealLife, the new documentary about teenagers and the internet from Beeban Kidron. Beeban, you really grab us with the first minute of this film, which I think a lot of parents are going to find confirms all their worst fears. Talking to Ryan, a sort of teenage, he's addicted to porn, but he's also just a connoisseur of the porn you can get online.
Well, I think so. And it was a big decision about whether to start in that way and start with what people are concerned about and then build out a much bigger picture of what we need to talk about and what we need to think about. And I think that Ryan does a fantastic job because not only does he show us what it is that a lot of young people are looking at and what the diet of sexuality that is available to them.
And he's so open about it.
He's so open about it, but he's also self-reflective. And I was talking to him only yesterday, and I think that he himself feels that actually stopping and thinking and talking to me in the film has actually changed his view. And I think, it is an extraordinary thing that my film is a 15. So that only kids of 15 can see this in context, the debate about it, the experts who refer to it. But actually, the kids who are watching that porn are much, much younger. And I think that I was trying to make that point, straight off.
And he does talk about, very interestingly, about the nature of relationships. I mean, his own worries about how it's changing his approach to women and making it difficult to have relationships with girls. I mean, that's quite a theme in all your conversations with these teenagers in the film, that it's sort of completely changing what it means to have a relationship.
I think that's right, because I think that was where my starting point was. I was sort of curious about whether relationships mediated by not only the technology, but the sort of the platforms within that technology, whether they were changing and what these adaptations mean. And obviously, kids do adapt, and quite rightly, and this is a sort of... I just wondered whether the liberatory technology had been slightly hijacked into actually being a sort of crudifying these relationships. And I think that one of the things that parents must think about is that kids are naturally, we were talking about teenagers here, they are naturally interested in sex and sexuality, and they are out there on the internet looking into those things. And all I'm saying in the porn element is that's not a good place to learn about sexuality. Other places are. We have to separate out these two issues.
I mean, obviously, this is something that people have been talking about for a while now. I think what was also really arresting about your film was when you're talking about the intimacy of the relationship that these teenagers have with their phones or with their Blackberries. And particularly, I mean, there's an excruciating interview with the woman who's called Paige in the book, and she talks about how devastated she was when she lost her first phone, and it's sort of like the end of her first relationship, and that when she says the phone came first, she allowed herself to be abused by a group of boys in order to get her phone back.
Yes, I think that one of the things about that story that I have to point out is, people are so shocked to hear that someone could actually put their phone ahead of their own personal safety and sort of self-respect, if you like. But what was extraordinary was that when she came to record that with me, to record the interview, she was there with another young woman to whom the exact same thing had happened. And they were then part of a wider community in which such things happen. So I do want to say that the kids in the film were hugely generous with their testimony, but each and every one of them represents scores and hundreds of other kids around the place. And I think that what I try to do in the film is actually have people who think about this very carefully, you know, really world experts, saying, look, this is not the fault of individual kids. That there is a sort of, there's not a level playing field here. The devices are very addictive. The technology has been sort of pulled into using certain sorts of addictive mechanisms, reward technologies, gaming technologies, within places that kids don't realise. And so the relationship with a phone can be a very, very addictive thing. And it's like saying, you know, put down a cigarette to a smoker or put down a drink to a drinker. And I think that's a very hard thing for a young person to negotiate. My film is about teenagers. It's about a point in your life where you should be able to experiment, perhaps transgress a bit, you know, go out there, try the edges of things. And all I'm saying is, you know, they're not entirely in a safe place. And we have to think about that a little bit harder now we live within the bubble of the internet, which we all do, and happily a lot of the time.
Well, there's a lot more things in the film I wanted to talk about, but I'm keen to get Jamal in, Jamal Edwards, who, I mean, we'll talk later about how you used YouTube and the internet to build your very successful music channels and music business. But, I mean, I'm really interested, what was your reaction to Beeban's film? Do you think it's just a middle-aged people fretting about these things, or did it make you think?
It made me think a lot. It made me think I'm going to stop using Facebook so much. It made me think how, like, all the data that they collect, how they use it, and it made me look deeper. So when I actually went onto Facebook, I was Google searching a few things, and on the side it was like bringing up the stuff that I'd Googled and all that sort of stuff, and it allowing US officials to, like 2 years ago, right down to the last minute of what you was looking at and stuff. It's just, I don't want to get too paranoid, but it just made me think and open my mind a little bit more than what it was before. Do
you think we're too worried about this sort of personal aspect, that people are only kind of communing with their phones and having relationships through their phones rather than... Because you're part of the music business. I mean, live music is still a big part of the youth music scene.
I think what internet's done is, like, kind of giving people a voice that necessarily didn't have a voice before, and also kind of allowing, like, people forget, like, just simple manners, like hello, good morning and stuff like that. Like, my friend would bump into my mum, and then you go into it and say, oh, I saw you today, but you wouldn't say something to her face. And it's weird how it's like that barrier of what's real and what's not. But it was very interesting. It's made me look at things a lot different. Yeah.
The other thing that I hadn't seen before, Beeban, which is a slightly different aspect to the film, is that you show all these pictures. You take us inside the cloud. You know, you see that these, you know, the cloud isn't really a cloud. It's this various warehouses of stored data at different key parts of the world, in an address in New York and various other places. What was behind it? Are you trying to demystify the internet, or what?
Well, absolutely. And I think that this is one of the interesting things, is that, you know, in the public discourse, people are very keen to polarise. You know, you're either a utopian about the internet or you're a detractor. And actually, most of us, it's bigger than that now, most of us are somewhere really in the middle, that what we want is the technology and all the sort of brilliant things that it brings, but we want actually slightly different values, and the values have become very commercial. And I found myself wondering, what is a cloud? You know, and why all the baby words? And why is everything tweeting and Googling and, you know, and sort of sounding like we're in a land of Teletubbies? And a lot of people have said to me, you know, oh, is your documentary going to be 1984 or Big Brother or something? And I go, no, actually, in the end, it's turned out to be Truman Show. This is where we are. We're in the Truman Show. There's a world outside. And I think that showing the cables, that was part of saying, this is wholly owned, this is big business. We have to think about it as a visceral terrible thing.
But it's funny, you were saying earlier that a lot of people had a reaction that you didn't expect, which is that they see these places and they start worrying that what would happen to all the data if it got destroyed, that they weren't, in a way, they're the opposite of how you thought they would respond.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And especially young people, say to me, oh my God, what if they bombed Facebook? Everything would go, And I do. I mean, listen, I acknowledge I'm a middle-aged woman. But when I went up to the attic the other day, I have this terrible admission, which is I have kept every letter.
You're a middle-aged woman and you have an attic.
I have an attic and I have 36 boxes of letters. Now, there's two interesting facts about it. One is that they run out at about 2006. Because people stopped sending me letters, so there's correspondence that has been going on my whole life. But also I realised that my kids don't have any artefacts of their own life. And should Facebook decide to stop cold storaging their photos, their messages, they would have none of their history in their possession.
They have a different kind of artefact, I think.
Yeah, because that's true with what you're saying is I used to have a book which I used to put all my press cuttings and whatever in. Like, my mum got me into that habit, and I think it starts with your parents, because if my mum didn't have it, I wouldn't have looked at that and used it. But I use Facebook for all my photos, and that's like one of the reasons I stay on it, because I'm able to keep up with old friends and kind of everyone. It's like collective of all my data in one. It's much more easier, and you can download everything into one file if you delete it and then sign back up, and it's just the easy option of still, but I still prefer physical things. It's like
Jamal is actually sitting here with Jamal is supposed to be showing us the future, and he's actually sitting with a very old-fashioned diary with lots of scrawled notes on it, all very neat handwriting. I should say.
I couldn't read my handwriting before, but it's sometimes I use my iPad, and sometimes I use this. It's just the kind of steady balance of them both.
All right, well, we've heard Beeban. I mean, Adrian, you're someone who has quite a more complicated view of the future, and you also design alternate reality games. I mean, stand up for the future here. What's the response to the middle-aged carping about we don't have any letters that come after 2006?
Well, I think one of the things to bear in mind about the internet, I'm 31, and people my age have grown up with the internet for 10, 15, 20 years. And
do you call yourself? Would a marketer call you a digital native?
Millennial or Gen Y or something terrible like that. And anyone my age or younger, they've grown up with too much porn, to be honest. I remember when I was at school, I had some friends, they know who they are, who looked at too much porn. And, now they're okay. Maybe they would have been better if they didn't see all that stuff. One of the things I try to do in general, and particularly in the book, is take a very long view of things. It's very easy to sort of look at a very snapshot in time. We have to do that and look at what the positives and negatives are. And there are negatives about the internet. But if we look at, statistics, my background as a scientist, if you look at, for example, teenage pregnancies, which is one of the things you might be worried about if people are getting strange ideas about sex. The last data that we have shows that teenage pregnancies are at their lowest level since 1969. I mean, people are getting, I don't know whether that's because of better sex education, better contraception, but I suppose what I'm wondering is, what is it that we're meant to be seeing that's going wrong? Because, I'm of the generation, we're of the generation which grew up with the internet, and we're not going out, murdering people.
Farida, you were nodding away to that.
Well, yeah, I think what is very interesting in the documentary in terms of making something visible, and I think what Jamal's picked up on is I'm much more kind of conscious of my Facebook use. I think the question for me is, what are we making visible and what are we imagining? And I think that's a very difficult question, because I think you can sort of show the cables, which I think allows for a really, really important discussion. But my question then is, what do we actually know about this? So I think it starts a really important discussion about actually the cloud is here and it's cables and it's in these warehouses. But I think, specifically in relation to Adrian's book, how can we make tangible, what are the metaphors, what are the ways in which we can talk about this cloud so that we can kind of critically approach it as citizens. And I think, that goes way beyond teenagers. So I think for me what's really important here is not just how can we imagine a future, but how do we understand the present?
Well, I think, and Beeban, I guess that is part of your film, is that you're just trying to step back. I mean, you're not just wanting to sort of complain about it.
No, not at all. I mean, I have to answer Adrian's point rather controversially, and I know it is, early on a Monday morning, but, one of the reasons that teenage pregnancies are going down is because of the role play that pornography shows does not end in pregnancy. So I don't want to say any more.
If you want to have any more detail, just
go
watch the film if you want to explain, or many other channels.
Many other channels, exactly. No, I think this is a really important point, and absolutely I am not a detractor, and I sort of resent that polarisation, and I think that the work that you're doing is extremely important in saying algorithms and engineers are not neutral. And if we can get that across, and yes, I mean, the internet's way too big to make one film about, and my film is very specifically about one part of the community, but I cannot tell you how many adults who've seen it have said, I have learnt from watching this, not just about my children, but for myself.
I mean, Farida, we will get onto that because she's done some very interesting work on the sort of the algorithms and the targeted advertising behind the cloud and behind all this software. But I want to start with, or go on to a slightly more positive vision from Jamal, because you made your fortune posting videos on YouTube. But I was quite struck that in your book Self-Belief, it's quite an old-fashioned sort of how-to guide for young entrepreneurs. I mean, not everything has changed about this world. I mean, you talk about actually trying to build contacts by walking past the BBC every day.
That was when I was working in Top Man, and I always used to see it was those name badges. So I used to always look at them and be able to, and because you see people quite often. Like, it's mad. Like, today I had the same cab driver 3 times, and it was much more of a open conversation. Oh, I've got you again, kind of sort of thing. And it's like that old kind of fashioned way of connecting with people. Just
tell us a bit about a short version of how you started, because it was back when you were 15.
Yeah, so
7 years ago.
Yeah, so I started basically filming my mates on my estate and kind of uploading it to YouTube. It wasn't really covered by the mainstream media, so I had quite a lot of buzz, and it was the only place which you could see what was going on in that specific area. And then it started building into something more. So it started helping out people like Ed Sheeran, Emily Sandé, Jessie J, and then I've been able to kind of even grow it past that and even interview people like David Cameron, Ed Miliband, even recently Prince Charles. So it's grown from what is music to kind of more of a life youth style channel where it is today.
Well, I think David Cameron and Ed Miliband want to interview you these days. They want to bring you into things as a face of
I think it's more of I've got quite a large following of young people, so I feel like it's a responsibility to kind of break that barrier between politics and between young people, because a lot of young people look at it and look at the jargon and think, oh, I'm not going to understand this. So I think I have that part, as well as providing music, I have that part to kind of inform them in a cool way.
I was quite interested because you've talked in a talk that you gave about a future Prime Minister being discovered on YouTube. Yeah. And a lot of people would hear that first and think, oh, it'll just be part of the trivialisation of politics and more people voting on Pop Idol than voting in the election. But actually you were saying something more positive, which is about that it could actually help narrow social divides and be a levelling thing, because it doesn't matter what school you went to when you're on YouTube.
Yeah, I think it's more about the segregation. So I'm from Acton, and the example I used was the Jack and Finney from Chiswick. And in the normal world, you wouldn't...
And they're also very successful on YouTube.
Yeah, they're other very successful YouTubers at the moment. They've also just raised £100,000 for teenage cancer research, which is phenomenal. But the whole thing of YouTube being this kind of level playing field, there's no kind of concept, judgment before you jump on YouTube. So we're just looking at each other for our content and for our views and subscribers, and that's how we talk to each other, which is quite an interesting way. Yeah.
But you don't feel that now you're sitting on the front row of fashion shows and everything that you still feel like you're talking to Britain's youth, talking to people back in Acton?
Yeah, I still feel like I'm in Acton all the time, so I still feel like I always have a steady balance. I'll be on that, but I'll still be out partying with my friends, and I'll still be out and about in the schools. And it's just about making sure that keeps me grounded and keeps me kind of in the loop of everything. And I think people always look at your success and your failures and nothing in between. So I always try and document what I'm doing so people have a look at it, so they don't just see me on the Burberry front row and think, they've seen the story of it grow, so they're much more in line with my story.
And they think maybe I could be there too.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
I want to ask Beeban about it because one of the other features of her film is this, it's quite critical about the corporate side of the internet, and that we're all too relaxed about these mega corporations that are behind these things. I mean, I guess, do you ever wonder about that? I mean, YouTube isn't just this sort of touchy-feely cooperative, it's also a massive corporation which is making a lot of money out of you.
Yeah, but I think this was very interesting, because when it said Apple's the top and Google's the second, but Apple's a simple transaction of you paying and you getting something back, where you might think Google or YouTube's a bit murky.
Yeah.
But I think the way that's worked, they might be making money off all the content creators that are on YouTube, but that's why they decided to give you an advert revenue split. For example, if they didn't give you a split, then people would question, like, why am I making videos, or how they're going to make money another way, if you get what I'm saying. So it's kind of like interesting how that was put out there.
You think it's unfair?
I think it's fair, because I think if there wasn't that split of advert revenue from the videos that you're making, maybe so many people wouldn't post. But everyone posts on YouTube nowadays thinking that they're going to make loads of money. But
a company ultimately controls your stuff and could control the way people see it, or whether they see it.
Yeah.
You don't worry about that?
I do. I do.
I'm not just here to make you worry about it.
Yeah. It makes me, it makes me think. It makes me think more than anything. It just opens my mind a little bit.
Farida?
Well, I just have a very quick question for Jamal. From your book, you say that it was only on the fourth go that YouTube actually gave you a partnership deal. So I guess what I think is quite interesting about that is that you have to be quite persistent as a user to actually get into that revenue stream. And I think in terms of, I suppose, the entrepreneurial skills you have, that persistence, is really important. So, I mean, how did you actually manage it?
So that was a very, very interesting. So I applied 3 times and it was a no. And I guess after the 4th time, it was like I got someone's email and I was like, look, it's something different. It's like, which has not been covered on YouTube before. But nowadays, I think you can get a partnership straight off, so it's much more easier, because they've seen the formula of what it has done. They're obviously going to be open to a lot more coming in. I
guess even old-fashioned way of being an entrepreneur was you had to be quite persistent as well. So in that sense, it's no different. But Beeban?
I think there's something really interesting in this exchange, which is this is an area where actually the companies are paying for people's data. Now, this is actually something that we'd like to see right across the net. So let's not be negative entirely. I mean, the YouTubers are an incredible community, and some of them are doing brilliant work, and I've met loads of young people who've actually have broken down the doors. But I think there's these 2 things. First of all, there's a fantasy that there's no gatekeepers. But look, Jamal had to try 4 times. There's gatekeepers. And I think that's all we're trying to say here, is it's not as neutral as it looks. I'm very pleased that these guys get money for their content. It's important they get money for their content. I actually think that we should all get a little money for our content, and that would level the playing field, and they might gather it a little bit less avariciously.
But I mean, but there were also a lot of gatekeepers in the sort of old-fashioned world. I mean, I was interested, Adrian, in your book, that you have this, you think about what might happen to education, what might happen to the job interview in a world in which you can never really tell whether someone's online checking their answers or not. It seemed to me, on balance, you thought that would be liberating in the sense of opening up what education was, for example, how people might develop themselves, not just about sort of new gatekeepers.
Yes, I mean, we do have new gatekeepers, and if you want to get on the Apple Store, you have to sort of pass that test, and that's quite annoying as an app developer. But compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, if you wanted to make a TV show, if you wanted to make a game, it's 10 times harder, 100 times harder. It's just a nightmare trying to get through to the commissioners or get through to the publishers. So as annoying as it is now, it's better than it used to be. And in terms of just access to opportunities. This is something that I think a lot of economists see happening, because as people have greater access to information, basically, they have access to the internet, they can educate themselves online using YouTube or using videos, or they can go on free online courses, and they will have access to sort of technologies that will make smartphones look like toys. So one of the things we've been seeing are things like head-up displays, which, if you think smartphones are bad, these are going to be very interesting, where you just sort of have a vision of the internet literally in your eyes or in your ears all the time, like Google Glass. And, if you think about what that can do, positively and negatively, that means that if you're in a job interview, if you're in a university interview, someone asks you a question, you have the answer, because you could just sort of whisper it and get it back. So do people need to memorize things anymore?
No more exams, I think, was also one of the interesting conclusions from your book.
I've tried on the Google Glass. It was quite interesting how it works. I think there could be a lot more work done to it, but it looks like that, exactly like your glasses, and it's got like it's got like a part on the
normal
right.
glasses.
Yeah, it's part on the right. But when you're saying like in 10 years, how I look at the world as like Minority Report, how you can just move things like all of that. I actually do think that like.
I had someone told me that their 2-year-old once, when they were putting them to bed, she saw him sort of waving in the air, and she realised actually he was trying to do the X in the top right-hand corner to cross out the sort of bedroom. Oh. There was a whole, which made me wonder about lots of things. But Farida,
I think in terms of this wearable technology, I think the other thing, going back to the kind of invisibility of this technology already now, is maybe a good example is the spying bins, the scandal of the spying bins in London, where these recycling bins, some of them were collecting data on people through their mobile phones. So they were sniffing your Wi-Fi, and they were collecting through the Mac device, or the Mac number in your phone. They were collecting data on you from literally just walking past. So I think, there's technologies we're aware of that are visible, like Google Glass, but then there are things that are happening in our everyday situations. We don't expect bins to spy on us and sniff out our data, but these things are happening right now, and that I think that's. But again, going back to the visibility, it's where do we look for these things?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find extraordinary is that there are people who are paid to press the like button for companies and corporations. And I think that, that the whole idea, and people now schedule their tweets so that they have a constant thing. I think we just have to look at this and say, yes, we're all adapting, yes, we're all here, but are these the values that we want? And the internet, in my view, is just part of real life, and it has to live by our collective values in the way that absolutely everything else does. We when the government wants to put up the speed limit to 80, the safety campaigners say, no, it's not safe. That's all it is. It's a conversation.
Farida, I mean, in your academic work, you have been known for your studies on social media and the role in the 2011 riots, and it was interesting because you sort of concluded from that it maybe had played less of a role than some people thought, that in fact people were still getting their information, whether it was in Cairo or in London, from the traditional news. But you seem to you've been drawn more now to the algorithms that lie behind all this, so you're no longer sort of looking at the tweets, but what lies behind them.
I mean, I'm looking at both, but I think again, going back to this kind of invisibility issue, I think what we need to understand much better is how these algorithms are collecting data on us, how they are making sense of the things we do on YouTube, the things we do on Facebook, and to really think hard about how they were created in the first place and how they then in turn process that data. So I think what we need to understand much better is what happens to all these traces that we leave online, who is collecting them, how are they being put together in these data warehouses that we saw in the documentary, and who is then making sense of that data. And I think in terms of what Adrian was saying in terms of the job interview, there's a measure now that is considered the standard measure of influence on the internet, which is a cloud score. And for me, what's really interesting is to unpack those algorithms and think about how are those measures of online influence being calculated. And if you look closely at what cloud is doing, it's quite problematic. But if that number about you becomes a tangible thing, for example, in a job interview where people say, well, actually, Jamal, what's your cloud score? Oh, it's lower than 60. Sorry, no job for you. Then it's really worth knowing how the algorithm has calculated Jamal's cloud score 60.
And you looked at your own cloud score. What did you find out?
Well, I mean, I'm only connected through cloud from Twitter, so I've only given them access to what I do on Twitter. But of course, what this company wants is more data. Ideally, what they get access to is my Facebook data or my LinkedIn data. And a message popped up a few months ago that said, if you give us your LinkedIn data, we'll give you 6 more points. Now, why is that? Is that because I am more influential? And actually, no, it's gamification to reward me, to give them more data. But that doesn't make me more influential. But if that measure of influence then becomes something in Adrian's future that has an impact on giving someone a job, we have to talk about this now.
But there is another side. I mean, you talk about, and I think you're going to be talking about targeted advertising in the Brighton Digital Festival. But, you know, I have to say, as someone who thinks about economics quite a lot of the time, I mean, economists think of targeted advertising as really efficient advertising that actually is less likely to be intrusive for the person being advertised to as well, because it's more likely to be something that they're interested in. So it isn't only, or we can get recommendations from Amazon that are actually quite accurate if we've given them more information. So, I mean, it seems to be that as consumers, we are willing to make that trade-off, and we have been for quite a while.
I think that's true. I think what's interesting about the way in which these things work is the kind of space they create. So I think Facebook has a particular feel, which means that when we go on Facebook, we don't really want to be sold to. Whereas if we go on Amazon, our expectation is this is a commercial space and we don't mind getting the recommendations, particularly if it's for something we like. But I think what we are increasingly seeing now is that these spaces are getting blurred and much more complicated. And there are spaces where certain information pops up and it's unsettling.
I mean, Jamal, do you think is that right, that there are still areas of the internet where your generation would still be wanting it to be free of advertising, or are you just much more comfortable about ads?
A bit of both. I would say I would rather be advertised for something that I'm interested in than something which I'm not. And if at the moment, if Facebook is pushing out the adverts, I'd rather I'm going to have adverts regardless. I'd rather be pushed towards the direction of that instead of maybe.
But
I was going to say something, but enlargement pills, like that's like the bait advert. So they're like enlargement pills for whatever is going on. But yeah.
But you're going to get less trusting of Facebook if it becomes more. Well, it already is. Very
a bit of everything. Is everyone on Facebook? Is everyone on Facebook in this room?
No.
No. Oh, so you're not on Facebook. I've been kind of in the middle. The only reason I won't get rid of Facebook is because for my pictures, like I've got pictures back to 2006 what I don't have in a physical copy, and that's got like loads of memories in it. That's probably the only reason why, and old friends. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, one thing I found a bit disconcerting about Facebook is that they sort of recreate your past with Facebook. So you go back having drawn. Well, and it's sort of, they take things from your past. So I've got a timeline on Facebook which goes back far longer than I've been on Facebook, and they've sort of gone and taken bits of my life and said, this is, you did this. And I do find that slightly kind of creepy. But Adrian, I know you've been trying to get in.
Well, I think one of the concerning things that I agree with the other speakers is that the fact that these, what seem like public spaces online, so Facebook, Twitter, Google, Reddit, other sites, are in fact controlled by very large corporations which are, which have to act in their shareholders' interests. And, these are clearly becoming part of the fabric of the internet, Google in particular. And I think that what will happen, actually, although it will need some sort of social pressure, is for these things to be regulated like utilities. I see that happening in the future. In fact, the EU probably will be one of the first people to do this. They're quite proactive. And, not necessarily regulated in the sense of, OK, we'll allow this content, we won't allow that content. That might happen. But also just in terms of data portability, so allowing people to leave Facebook easier. I mean, you can kind of do that, but it's quite difficult. You get all your files in one big lump. And, you know, this is obviously not something that the big corporations would ever want to see. I'm sure they'll fight tooth and nail to make sure they can stay nimble and agile. But
that is what's happened in the past. That's been the sort of cycle.
Yes.
People move to regulation. We should say a bit more about your book, The History of the Future in 100 Objects. And we've had an email, actually, wanting to know where the future jobs will come from. And you do talk about that. It's more about where the jobs will go in the future.
Yes. If you look at self-checkout tills now and Amazon.com, and if you think 10 years ahead to Google's driverless car, the fact is that we're seeing increasing levels of software and automation basically vanishing jobs away, particularly in the middle and the low end, and a lot of the rewards are going towards people who have a lot of money, the 1% so-called. I don't think those jobs are coming back. People hope that we'll be able to retrain people, but we can't have 10 million programmers in the UK. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. John Maynard Keynes actually thought about this back in 1930. He estimated that productivity would increase by 8 times in the next century, and he wanted to know what would happen. And his optimistic view was that would allow people to just work 15 hours a day, so 15 hours a week, not a day, and that we could go and enjoy ourselves. And it's really unusual that in this time of incredible productivity, which is just increasing all the time, it feels like an incredibly terrifying thing. It feels terrifying that the jobs are going away, and people are worried that they won't be able to survive.
We've in fact found the productivity has gone up just as much as Keynes said, but we've all found more things to buy and want, and more work to do somehow, or more work that we want to do. But you do end up with, I guess the suggestion in your book is that it will take us a long time to reach that point, but we might well reach that point where we're actually taking advantage of the fact that we don't have to work for basic survival.
And I think that is a really kind of profound change, because if you look at the past centuries, particularly with the Protestant work ethic, how are people going to adapt to the idea that you don't actually have to work to survive? And if you look at the sort of political discourse, people who are just sort of taking money from Social Security, what you meant to say to people when then there literally are no jobs, then when your sort of job can be done faster and better by a robot. And that's one of the things I try to explore in the book.
The other theme that I thought was really interesting, and it goes back to some of the things in Beeban's film, is this idea that we'll have this technology which allows us to sort of leapfrog lots of problems or take away the friction out of life and maybe instantly translate what people are saying in different languages. But in the process, we'll lose, you say at one point, we've lost bandwidth. You lose, with your special sort of speaking technology, you lose the intonations and the sort of irreplaceable range of human conversation.
Yeah, I think that, with every kind of leap in technology, there's a reason why we adopt it, because it's useful, but we do lose something in the same way that when we invented writing, you lose some of the intonation that you get from the spoken word. And if you have machine translation, which we already have with Google at the moment, it's pretty good. It's better than nothing, but it's not as good as a human translator. It's certainly not as good as learning a language yourself. But that's going to happen. I mean, people are going to... We already see this now. People don't think learning a language is as valuable as it was before. And, that's the sort of human condition. We sort of go forward and we lose things, and we sort of pick things up and we put things down. But
one of the things about music, and I've talked to quite a lot of people who are really interested and have been... Growing up, they were really interested in the best stereo and the best speakers, and it was all about the quality of the sound. And then they've got kids who don't seem to care about the sort of tinny music coming through their headphones, the MP3, which has had so much of its range compressed. I mean, Jamal, do you feel that you've lost out on just the actual range of the music that a lot of people are listening to?
I don't think I've lost out, but I always look at things. You can have the best product, or the really, two ends of the spectrum. It's just about how you use it and how your take is on it. When I first started, I didn't have the best camera, but I knew how to make the best out of that to make what I was happy with, sort of thing. But I guess, I don't know.
But I mean, the DJs, quite often, they still use LPs because that is actually a better quality sound.
Yeah, and some DJs will use a certain particular type of headphones which might not necessarily block out all the outside noise, but because it looks good and everyone's got it,
I think that's
they'll
the
wear
point.
it.
I mean, Beeban, it's sort of full circle, because at the very end of your film there's a much more positive view of relationships on the internet. There's a gay teenager who lives in the north, who's not is in an isolated community, hasn't come out to his parents, and he has his relationship. He's been going out with someone for a long time online. They haven't even met. It is a limited relationship, but he might not have any relationship if he wasn't able to access the internet and wasn't able to meet that person online.
No, absolutely. And that's part of the whole thing of the film, is not to be a for or against, but to actually look at new norms. And one of the new norms is meeting strangers in real life. So Tom and Dan had known each other quite intimately online, and they felt that they had, as Tom says, 100% of a relationship. But actually, two things happened. One was that I actually went with him and they met for the first time, which is what you see in the film. And as
It's a really touching moment. I mean, it's a wonderful bit of footage.
It is gorgeous. And, and of course I did provide cover and safety for that meeting, because nothing was going to happen to Tom, because I was there and I could have intervened. But I think that this idea about our generation coming to terms with meetups in parks and people meeting online and finding safe ways of doing, that's another thing we've got to deal with, those things. And I do think that it is a beautiful relationship, and it was a fantastic possibility for him to reach out beyond his real-life community.
See, we haven't just been complaining about the future and ranting about people not writing letters anymore. We've ended on an up note. I'm sorry, Jamal, I know you want to get in, but we're going to have to take it offline. Thank you to all my guests. Farida Viz from the University of Sheffield, who's taken part in the month-long Brighton Digital Festival. Adrian Hon, he's at Future Fest next weekend at Shoreditch Town Hall in London, and his History of the Future in 100 Objects is available as an e-book and will be published later this month. Jamal Edwards' Self-Belief, The Vision, is out now, and Beeban Kidron's documentary InRealLife is on general release. Next week, more teenage angst, but this time as a mythic red winged monster. And if you want to understand what I'm talking about, I will be talking to Anne Carson, Daljit Nagra, Richard Eyre and Graham Robb about it next week. For now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Here and Now, In Real Life, the new documentary about teenagers and the internet from Beeban, Baroness Kidron. Beeban, you really grab us with the first minute of this film, which I think a lot of parents are going to find confirms all their worst fears. Talking to Ryan, a sort of teenage, he's addicted to porn, but he's also just a connoisseur of the porn you can get online.
Well, I think so. And it was a big decision about whether to start in that way and start with what people are concerned about and then build out a much bigger picture of what we need to talk about and what we need to think about. And I think that Ryan does a fantastic job, because not only does he show us what it is that a lot of young people are looking at and what the diet of sexuality that is available to them.
And he's so open about it.
He's so open about it, but he's also self-reflective. And I was talking to him only yesterday, and, and I think that he himself feels that actually stopping and think the platforms within that technology, whether they were changing and what these adaptations mean. And obviously, kids do adapt, and quite rightly, and this is a sort of, I just wondered whether the liberatory technology had been slightly hijacked into actually being a sort of a crudifying these relationships. And I think that one of the things that parents must think about is that kids are naturally, we were talking about teenagers here, they are naturally interested in sex and sexuality, and they are out there on the internet looking into those things. And all I'm saying in the porn element is that's not a good place to learn about sexuality. Other places are. We have to separate out these two issues.
And obviously this is something that, people have been talking about for a while now. I think what was also really arresting about your film was when you're talking about the intimacy of the relationship that these teenagers have with their phones or with their Blackberries, and particularly, I mean, this excruciating interview with the woman who's called Paige in the book, and she talks about how devastated she was when she lost her first phone, and it's sort of like the end of her first relationship, and that she allowed, when she says the phone came first, she allowed herself to be abused by a group of boys in order to get her phone back.
Yes, I think that one of the things about that story that I have to point out is, people are so shocked to hear that someone could actually put their phone ahead of their own personal safety and sort of self-respect, if you like. But what was extraordinary was that when she came to record that with me, to record the interview, she was there with another young woman to whom the exact same thing had happened. And they were then part of a wider community in which such things happen. So I do want to say that the kids in the film were hugely generous with their testimony, but each and every one of them represents Scoreking, and talking to me in the film has actually changed his view. And I think, it is an extraordinary thing that my film is a 15, so that only kids of 15 can see this in context, the debate about it, the experts who refer to it. But actually, the kids who are watching that porn are much, much younger. And I think that I was trying to make that point, straight off.
And he does talk about, very interestingly, about the nature of relationships. I mean, his own worries about how it's changing his approach to women and making it difficult to have relationships with girls. I mean, that's quite a theme in all your conversations with these teenagers in the film, that it's sort of completely changing what it means to have a relationship.
I think that's right, because I think that was where my starting point was. I was sort of curious about whether relationships mediated by not only the technology, but the sort of the...
Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello. Today we're talking about the internet and what it's doing not just to our children, but pretty much everything else as well. The 22-year-old media entrepreneur, Jamal Edwards, doesn't spend much time fretting about the impact of modern technology. He's too busy living it and too taken with the opportunities it offers to anyone with the right kind of self-belief. No one, he says, cares which school you went to on YouTube. The academic Farida Viz is interested in how YouTube and the other social media are changing the meaning of news and blurring the line between that and good old-fashioned rumour. And the blogger and game designer Adrian has bigger fish to fry in his book, A History of the Future in 100 Objects. In it, he conjures a detailed and arresting vision of a late 21st century world where technology has helped us advance so far, it's hard to say what it means anymore to be human. But let's start with